So next slide, please. Are you able to advance? Okay, so welcome to our TIEEN webinar today. Our topic is industrial energy efficiency in a volatile, high-priced energy market. So as you know, energy prices are notoriously volatile. This is due to a multitude of factors. Some of those are global, some of them are regional. And just recently, we've seen the whipsaw price action that's resulted from the pandemic, Winter Storm Uri. Now, of course, more recently, the war in Ukraine. But these are just a few examples. So the real subject of our session today is how can a company make rational energy efficiency investments in this environment of whipsaw price action in energy? Just to put this in a sort of personal perspective, when I think of this subject, I have to think back to my own personal experience, because many years I actually worked as an industrial energy efficiency consultant, working mostly with refineries and petrochemical plants. And that business went pretty well for more than a decade. But then came 2016. So back in 2014, to put it in perspective, natural gas prices were up around $5 per million BTU. By early 2016, they were down around 1.8. At least that's where they bottomed out. And my business went from pretty good, thank you very much, to virtually zero. And the net result of that was that I ended up taking an overseas assignment, and I ended up being in Saudi Arabia, of all places, for 3 years, basically because the US, being so much natural gas driven in industry, suddenly was not a lucrative market, or not even a viable market for energy efficiency people like myself. So this whole issue of price action in energy has a lot of implications. Some of them are global, some of them come down to corporate decisions, and some of them, like what I just talked about, come down to very personal decisions that we make as a result of these prices. So we're going to get some expert opinion or some expert discussion in our session today. Here are our panelists. You'll see on the screen our moderator, Jamie Brick from McKinsey, Jeremy Keller, SVP of Business Development at Rondo, and Raoul LeBlanc with S&P Global. And we'll say a bit more about them later, but for the moment, next slide, please. So just some housekeeping here, but to that point about details of our speakers, rather than giving detailed introductions, we have the information on the speakers on a website for you to visit if you want to get that information, along with the other webinar details. So I can see all of you furiously writing down those random letters and numbers there, just so you're able to get to that link. Alternatively, if you look in the chat, I just put the information there, and that might be a bit easier for you. Just general housekeeping notes. Please, would you stay muted and keep your video off unless you are a presenter. Note too that for Q&A in this session, we will be using the chat box. Hopefully you're all familiar with how to do that. And another point, I think a number of people on the call are professional engineers, licensed engineers. We will be making PDH certificates available at the end of this webinar for those of you who would like one of those. And then the final point, also at the end of the webinar, we do have a link to our survey. And for all TEEP and TIEEN events, we do try to get feedback from our participants so that we're able to pursue continuous improvement in the programs. Next slide, please. All right, before we get to our topic on the volatility of energy prices and the effect on industrial investment in energy efficiency, I do want to introduce TIEEN and the TIEEN member organizations. So what is TIEEN? Well, it's the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Network. And it is, as the name implies, a network, but it's a network of publicly supported industrial energy efficiency organizations. And it's funded through a grant from the State Energy Conservation Office. And I would also note it is operated through UH Energy at the University of Houston, which is how I get to be involved in this webinar. And it's a very interesting group to work with. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. What I'd now like to do, though, is to let the individual organizations within TIEEN introduce themselves or have their representatives introduce themselves. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So over to you, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I'm Todd McAllister, the Executive Director of SPEAR, which is the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a Resource. We are one of the 6 RIOs, the regional energy efficiency organizations that are scattered throughout the U.S. Our region is Texas and Oklahoma. We are Austin-based. Basically, our mission is to accelerate the adoption, as it says there, of energy efficiency products and services in Texas and Oklahoma. We primarily do this in the built environment, is where our primary focus is. And then we do a lot of promoting policies as well that advance the energy efficiency technology research and innovations. And as everybody knows, the innovations are coming fast and furious right now. So next slide. Basically, our vision is to position SPEAR as the regional leader in education and promotion of energy efficiency within the building systems and those distributed energy resources, DERs, that strengthen the local economies. As I said, our focus is basically building tech optimization, the built environment, local government programs that we work with in concert with the non-attainment areas here in Texas through the EPA air mandates. We work really closely with code enforcement and code enhancement organizations. We are huge on heat pump adoption, and then we have workshops and trainings as well. So that is it for SPEAR. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks a lot. Next slide, please. So Kurt, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. My name's Kurt Middlecoop. I'm with the Texas Manufacturing Assistance Center, and we are the state affiliate for the Manufacturing Extension Program. Basically, we're a federal program designed to help manufacturing organizations to grow and become globally competitive. Part of that delivery is helping organizations to integrate lean, environmental, safety, and also energy into a single program where they could get out of their siloed thinking. This year, we have a pollution prevention grant from the US EPA where we're introducing smart sensors. If you're interested, please contact me. We have 8 opportunities for manufacturers to receive on-site kilowatt metering that's internet connected that we will then monitor to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate that. By the way, for those of you who were wondering, the information I'm putting in the chat is contact information and website information for each of these organizations. Next slide, please. Okay, Carlos, over to you and Hawk.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Gamarra, Director of the Clean Energy Technology Group at the Houston Advanced Research Center. And for those who don't know HARC, we are a nonprofit research organization based in the Woodlands. Our mission is to provide independent analysis on energy, air, water, and water issues to people seeking for scientific answers. So we are an independent research organization. Most of our work is focused on research projects funded by the federal government, for the most part, the Department of Energy. And we focus on making energy technologies accessible to disadvantaged communities, make the planning technologies more accessible to developers and users, kind of connecting the science with the engineering on how to make what's the right mix of where are the right opportunities to deploy clean energy technologies at the residential, commercial, industrial, and community levels.
Next slide.
This is my contact information. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and also that's got on the chat as well. Thank you, Carlos. Appreciate that. And next up is the IAC program. Jim, over to you.
Yes, I'm Jim Acaprat. I'm the assistant director, one of the 2 assistant directors at the Texas A&M University Industrial Assessment Program. This is a federally funded program around the country. There are 37 centers around the country at all universities. There are 3 in Texas now. Us at Texas A&M have been in existence since 1987. There's a brand new center at University of North Texas in Denton, and a center that's been online for about 5 or 6 years, I think, at UT Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, down in the valley. We come to manufacturing plants and wastewater treatment plants and do a no-cost energy conservation study for that site. We quantify what the savings are, get a conceptual idea of the implementation cost, and what results in all this is a formal bound report sent to the plant within 60 days. And that's how we meet the contract with the DOE. You see listed there that each assessment is has a staff person like myself. The director is Dr. Brian Rasmussen, and Dr. Matthew Elliott is the other assistant director, and we're all part of the mechanical engineering department here at the university and in College Station. And we usually bring about 4 to 6 students on each visit with us, and they're all hired staff with a program and all that type of stuff. You see listed there the DOE established criteria for the manufacturing plants. The site, everything is done on a site level, has to have less than 500 employees and annual sales of $100 million. Energy costs somewhere in the range of $100,000 per year, up to $3.5 million, and we can get an exception if they're somewhat outside that, and to have no on-site staff energy manager that could perform the assessment themselves. And this is for small to medium-sized manufacturing plants within our area, about 180 miles from College Station. So we hit Houston, San Antonio, south side of Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, Temple, and points in that 180-mile radius. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. And now to our final member in team, that is PACE. Over to Dub.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, PACE is a financing program, a new financing program, 10 years new, enabled by the state legislature a decade ago, and has been rolled out now around the state in different local cities and counties through local programs. And it is a new financing mechanism that can support projects that have high capital costs and long payback, which is most industrial energy efficiency projects. Next slide. Can we go to the next one? Okay, here we go. So our organization, Texas PACE Authority, we're a nonprofit. 7 years old. We administer PACE programs now across the state for 85 cities and counties, covering about 73% of the population. So PACE financing can be used for any energy efficiency, water conservation, or distributed generation projects. It is long-term, low-cost, budget-neutral, private financing. So not public dollars, but a public mechanism that provides security for longer-term financing for projects that require that. Next slide. So any project that can reduce energy or water consumption or demand or generate power on site is potentially eligible. In the industrial space, it includes a host of heating and cooling technologies, controls, mechanical insulation, combustion and burner upgrades, et cetera, distributed generation systems and CHP, and then a host of water conservation projects as well. And the key to PACE is that it does not require use of internal capital. Oftentimes, you have great projects teed up. You present these projects to your capital committee. They're looking for a 6-month payback or maybe a year, and the projects sit on the shelf. PACE can provide financing that does this in a cost-effective, budget-neutral way and allows those projects to move forward that generate benefits over the long term. So I'll stop there, Alan, and happy to be part of the TIEEN network and look forward to speaking with you.
Great, thanks, Dub. Okay, next slide, please, Shivraj. All right, at this point, I would like to hand things over to our moderator for the panel discussion, who is Jamie Brick, Expert Engagement Manager at McKinsey. Over to you, Jamie.
Hello, thank you, Alan, and for everybody who's provided all the information so far. So I'm an expert engagement manager at McKinsey and Company. I primarily work in the energy space and work across the value chain in natural gas and help companies on a variety of things around sustainability strategy, of which energy efficiency is one of them. And then as well, given the highly volatile energy markets of recent, definitely had some questions coming through on clients and supporting clients on how to make heads or tails of this. So I'll primarily tee up the kind of statement of play, and then I'll be passing this over to my co-presenters, and Jeremy and Raoul, in terms of some of the more specific things around this. So we can move to the next slide. So just to kind of, provide a bit of context, in 2021 and 2022, as you see by the vertical bar, we really were seeing, record highs of energy volatility. And so what this chart is showing is annualized volatility. Think about it kind of like a standard deviation of Henry Hub gas prices, overlaid by the line, which is the Henry Hub gas price in dollars per BTU. So you really haven't seen this sort of volatility in high prices since really the shale revolution took off around 2008. And so really we were kind of coming into a very unique situation. This volatility was driven by a variety of things, whether it was upstream shale gas producers showing a bit of capital discipline, storage inventories were low, there were some supply chain issues around a variety of other things, and then as well the lower coal capacity in the power sector, making gas demand less elastic. But there were a variety of things that were driving this volatility, and this made it very difficult for companies to manage their energy costs as a result of this. Which this volatility is somewhat interesting, which if we go to the next slide, is based upon, given what we see as the fundamentals of North American gas prices. So this is a lot to unpack, but basically, if you look at the chart here, what you see on the horizontal axis is the amount of reserves. And then on the vertical axis is what it costs to produce those reserves. And so what you see is that there's a lot of low cost natural gas in North America. So much so that if you were to have, no infrastructure constraints and a kind of best case scenario, you could see long-term gas prices at around $2.80 per MMBTU. And this is, more or less what our kind of long run average going forward is. We do anticipate some infrastructure constraints, which will push up that price, but $3 to $3.50 is kind of what we'd expect to see for long run prices. And given the wide flat part of the supply curve, demand can shift up or down on a long run basis, and prices shouldn't change too much. So the volatility we saw recently was really somewhat unusual, and part of this was pandemic related, part of this was capital discipline related from the producers, but what drove this was a variety of different things. So fundamentals, we really were expecting to see prices.
Things, but James,
please everyone keep yourselves muted. Sorry, Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. And if there's any questions, please do feel free to put them in chat, and we'll this is a panel discussion, so we'll be happy to take these live as well in a second. Just kind of trying to frame this up here. So, if we move on to the next slide, what we saw in terms of pricing is, prices have come down since last year. So if you remember on, a couple slides back, the average price in 2022 was $6.4. We are now seeing prices around $2 per MMBTU. So prices certainly have come down, but we are expecting prices to creep up again. If you look at the forward curves, so much so that if you look at the, summer to winter price spreads, so typically gas prices are lower in the summer, to May to September, then November to March, which is when peak heating is. You're seeing some sort of price per MMBTU spreads that are quite large. So these are fairly large increases compared to what we've seen recently. So my takeaway of all of this is a lot of low cost gases out there. However, there's been some dislocations in the market recently, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty going forward in terms of what's needed. So, the fundamentals are there for low cost gas, but there's quite a bit of demand uncertainty going forward, which if we go to our next slide, and thinking about what this means for smaller to medium-sized businesses, there's basically two broad categories in terms of how this higher prices or price volatility or price uncertainty impacts them differently than I'd say a larger organization. And the first one is around the financials. So, as some of my previous comment speakers were talking about, financing opportunities, et cetera. A lot of the smaller players don't have access to the same capital that a lot of the larger players have. Additionally, their smaller balance sheets, and it makes it difficult for them to weather price volatility. And oftentimes it's difficult to pass on these costs to customers. So if you're a regulated utility, you just pass on, gas prices go up, you pass that on to your customers as a pass through. It's not quite the same as it is for a lot of smaller organizations. Additionally, the smaller organizations tend to not have, detailed energy price forecasts. They just don't have the scale number of employees to do this. It's more hard for them to hedge energy costs, unlike a lot of the other larger players. And then as well, they may not have an idea, a ready list of energy investment opportunities, energy efficiency opportunities for them to invest in. So when you combine all those things together, and you can add into the the uncertainty that we see going forward, small to medium-sized enterprises really do benefit from reducing their energy costs, because after all, that's not a core business of theirs oftentimes. And so them being able to lower their overall energy costs and make that less volatile from an earnings and cost perspective is something that definitely adds things. And the only way you believe that this is not something that adds value would be if you believe that, cold fusion or something comes along where energy becomes too cheap to meter. But, outside of those unrealistic expectations, increasing energy efficiency is pretty much a no regrets move. And it's something that not only has environmental benefits, but also ultimately, generally speaking, has financial benefits as well. So that's just me kind of teeing this up for the conversation for a bit later, but let me pass over to Jeremy Keller. If you flip to the next slide. So Jeremy Keller is a Senior Vice President of Business Development at Rondo Energy, which is a very interesting and very cool technology that is this form of heat energy storage behind the meter. Previously, he worked at Ameresco, which was a renewable and energy efficiency development company. And I am very excited to hear what he has to say about how heat batteries can help.
Thanks, Jamie. Let's hit the next slide. So this, I like this slide because it's a year old now, but I loved the super wide range of where the confidence intervals were for WTI and volatility. And I was just checking the price, and I think it was at like 80 here. So they actually kind of nailed it on the forecast, which is kind of shocking. But again, I'm going to repeat some of the information I think Jamie had on just some of where volatility looks like. Next slide here. Yeah, again, if you go back past 2000 and you look at natural gas prices, they're all over the board. And 2010 to 2020 was pretty stable, but it's a difficult thing to plan capital investment around with that wide range of natural gas prices. Keep going forward, please. Next slide. Folks in Texas are probably less familiar with this chart, and I'll pause here for a second. But globally, on this chart, there's 5 different carbon markets shown, and it's missing another. Canada has another one that has different impacts in each of the different provinces, and I like to highlight that as you think about carbon prices globally, they're starting to impact Texas. We're getting a lot of calls from Texas refineries and chemicals and steel and cement manufacturers that are that might be exporting to Europe and are looking at the European Union's carbon price as the carbon border adjustment mechanism is starting to go into place. Similarly, California, they have a low carbon fuel standard. And so Texas manufacturers that are feeding fuel into California can realize $100 a ton CO2 price. But these are also extremely volatile and can, be a challenge to invest around or really to rely on. And carbon markets are expanding geographically. Next slide.
Oops. Sometimes it happens.
Is this the slide? Go back one. Sorry, I lost my pattern. Okay, keep going. Next slide. So, today, and we might get into a little bit more of my commercial speech here on heat batteries, but, today everybody's burning natural gas in boilers for steam for their facility. Forward one slide, please. And what we see is that with renewable energy and electricity, and it falls broadly under efficiency, but there's a coming, and today it's here and it's growing where it's cost-effective opportunity to really electrify. And strangely enough, it's a pathway to reducing your exposure to volatility by actually taking advantage of the volatility. That sounds round robin. I'll explain it a little bit more. Hit the next slide, please. Broadly, we've seen that renewable electricity prices have dropped 90% in the last 10 years. And in Texas, you are at the forefront of massive wind and solar deployments. And where it's overlapped now such that in a lot of places geographically, renewables can be cheaper than natural gas. It's mostly true in locations that are exposed to LNG prices or carbon prices. Next slide. We all know that Texas electricity gets really expensive, right? That's the fundamental of how the market's designed. That market is going through a redesign. We'll see how it works in the future. But when you think about electricity, most folks kind of think of, man, those spikes just make it impossible to try and use for electricity for my process heat. Keep going. One more slide. When we look though at a random 3 days last year, you can see that there's hours where, sure, electricity was pretty expensive at $250 a megawatt hour, but then there's also a number of hours there that are either close to zero or negative. One more slide, please. The 90% drop in prices of renewables is historic. So if you look back 10 years at what solar and wind PPAs were going for, and you look to today, it's dropped at about 90%. But if you look, go back. If you look at just those hours of the day there that are highlighted in pink, and if you were only buying electricity during those periods, your price that day would have been negative $6 a megawatt hour. And that's clearly cheaper than natural gas. $5 a megawatt hour, or excuse me, $5 a million BTU is equivalent to about $22 a megawatt hour, just for your reference there. Next slide. And if you expand that out and you look at the annual basis, this is the West Hub in Texas. Your average price just buying around the clock, if you were buying straight wholesale and not paying any transmission or distribution, just that hub zone price, is about $50 a megawatt hour last year. But if you looked and you said, I was perfect at this, and all I did was buy the cheapest 6 hours every day, your price is about 22. And there's this real interesting thing that happens that we see across all of the electricity markets, where as you get to that renewable penetration of about 40–50%, you pretty reliably have this scenario where those bottom 6 hours are at least half of what the around the clock price might be. One more slide, please. But industry runs 24/7, and you need heat delivered reliably 24/7, and you can't be ramping your boilers up and down all of the time. And so we built our heat batteries, which are electrified thermal energy storage, to charge from, I like the solar shape because it's easy to visualize. We charge when the sun is shining, when those electricity prices are cheap, or when the wind is blowing. And then we store that and we deliver it as around the clock dispatchable heat steam. One more slide. So hit forward just 3 times, I think. So this is our heat battery. It stores 320 megawatt hours of energy, charges at up to 100 megawatts. And that's a drop-in replacement for a 70,000 pound of steam per hour boiler. It's about an 85 million BTU per hour boiler. This system can charge in 6–7 hours every day, and delivers steam 24/7. And so as we look at those wholesale prices in Texas, you're able to capture those cheapest hours every day, store them, and then deliver steam 24/7 around the clock. One more slide. And it's, you know, for a lot of facilities and a lot of folks, you're getting a lot of pressure from stakeholders and customers on reducing carbon intensity of your products. This is a cost-effective way to reduce your scope 1 emissions. That's the emissions from your on-site process heat. You know, it's compelling economics, and there is that high volatility, but there's a lot of ways that you can get a long-term hedge for those electricity prices. With the virtual PPAs that the new renewables are signing, and then also from energy wholesale suppliers, a lot of folks out there are trying to buy the opposite side of that, and that they're looking for somebody that will take those low price hours under a long-term contract so that they can get their renewable project financed. And then the other thing I want to point out is that if you haven't been paying too much attention to the Inflation Reduction Act, the new production tax credit in it for wind and solar allows those new facilities to operate cost effectively all the way down to negative $33 a megawatt hour. And so as you think about all of the new wind and solar that are coming online in the Texas grid, assuming the state legislature doesn't prohibit it, you're going to see a lot more of those hours during the middle of the day or when the wind is blowing overnight, where they're going to be driven to this highly negative number, negative 33, which is quite a bit lower than it has been in the past. And as that renewable penetration continues to increase, you're going to have more and more of those very low price hours during the day where, you know, electricity from the grid with thermal energy storage can provide very compelling low cost steam. I think that's it. Next slide. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Raoul.
Thanks. I love that idea, Jeremy. I mean, I think you're right. As your penetration rate of renewables increases, frankly, the first tranches are the easiest, right? But we're going to get increased cannibalization, right? And that's where storage technologies can come in handy. And I haven't seen a heat storage like you got. Very, very interesting. Hi, folks. My name is Raoul LeBlanc. I'm really from the upstream land, upstream meaning oil and gas production. And so I thought from my point of view, I did in a previous life, actually, I was telling Alan the other day, work at an energy efficiency group, which I found fascinating. And I ended up going a different way, but I've always been curious. So I'm glad to be here today. I guess what I thought I would do is let's take a step and I'd like to give you some framing concepts. So I'm going to throw out a bunch of concepts today. And the point of this is really to help you to maybe be able to understand better some of the drivers and the implications of energy price volatility. And as you do two things. One, as you interpret news flow, right? We all live in this world and it seems like there's a whole bunch of things going on. It's true, there are. We are certainly have a high noise to signal ratio. So hopefully these things will get you thinking in ways that help you interpret the news flow. The second one is as you assess your energy efficiency opportunities or think about that sector, hopefully these concepts may be helpful for you to understand volatility, energy security, and increasingly optionality, which is where I think a lot of the action and the interesting parts are. All right, if you go to the next one, I decided to take a quick review, if you will, of why, in particular, I'm going to focus on oil and gas markets, but oil and gas markets, of course, have a very high knock-on effect with electricity markets due to gas pricing generally setting the price for a lot of markets, including not only the ERCOT and most of the US, but also the European markets, right? Which has interesting effects for your competitiveness globally. So focus on that and let's talk about volatility. As Jamie showed, great chart, Jamie, on the volatility on the prices on both oil and gas. So what are the key drivers that are making prices? And a couple things I would note here. One is the there's actually three drivers. I only put two, but I'll tell you the third one. It's not a secret. So the first one is fundamental supply and demand. So we see these graphs all the time of this is happening. And you see this when you get something like, hey, OPEC is going to release is going to make a cut to production. What they're trying to do is impact the overall supply and demand. That's what makes the most sense to us. People who have taken economics. Yeah, okay, that's what is going to drive prices. But oil has two other drivers. One is paper market activity. So the oil market is the largest of the commodity markets. And people use oil not only as a physical commodity, like you and I might use it to drive around or power your facility. They also use it as a speculative financial instrument. And so the point is the oil price has correlations to economic growth. It has correlations to the dollar. It has correlations to all sorts of events. And so it tends to get driven around by people in the market who are betting one way or the other on, say, interest rates or currency exchange rates. They are piling into this. And while the oil market may seem like a big market, it's not really when you compare it to something like Forex or other interest rate markets, which have hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars flowing through all the time. And it's a little bit like an ocean overflowing into a lake. When those guys decide to get long on oil and gas, watch out. And so this has an ability, and often does, to exaggerate price moves. You get a lot of momentum from speculators, right? And they will drive the price. We saw this perfectly last year. You're like, why on earth did the price go to 140 one day? That was a paper market phenomenon. Okay, this is people who are jumping in on the Ukrainian war news and saying it's going to make oil go up. This is a good speculative investment, and I need to get in. All right. But you have to live in the world, the real world, where you might have to pay for that oil and gas to run a facility. The third one, which I've neglected to mention, is politics. Okay? So oil and gas is pretty heavily politicized due to the inherent nature of its distribution around the world, right? We all know it's distributed highly in some places and not highly in other places, okay? What that means is that it's immovable. And so you have people who have a heavy influence. The other thing is, in most places around the world, actually everywhere, almost completely, outside of the United States, in every single place, the oil and gas under the earth is not owned by the landowner who owns the surface like it is in, say, Texas. Instead, it is owned by the government. It is a national patrimony. And so all this money that you think the oil companies are making, the national oil companies, they're not really making. It flows right into the government treasury, and they rarely get the ability to use it. As a result, oil gets politicized, and all sorts of crazy things go on in terms of that. On the production side, we also saw last year, it goes on the consumer side too, whether it's the SPR in the United States or it's a consumer price cap in some country. We have a lot of politics involved. Those three elements are not going anywhere and will continue to drive your volatility. So if you think the world's getting more politicized, watch for more volatility on oil and gas in a lot of ways. Second one, marginal pricing and transmission. So one thing I'll say is that one of the things that makes the oil market a bit more problematic, it also solves problems, but is the inherent decline rate. So oil is a wasting asset. It is unlike a factory. You know, if you build a factory and it's producing at maximum value today, you can expect it to produce at maximum value tomorrow. Okay, things age very, very slowly. You don't come the next day and there's another brick missing. Okay, that's not the case for an oil and gas asset. Every day you come is worse than the day before. The pressure is depleting relentlessly, and what this means is that the industry needs very high margins on per barrel basis, not because it's greedy, but because it has to replace this inherent decline. This decline rate is somewhere between 4 and 9% for almost all assets around the world. The one big exception, because of the shale revolution, is In the US, it is more than about 30%. So if you stop activity in the US, and we saw this in 2020, it will literally fall off a cliff, okay, supply. So supply is very reactive. And so if you get a situation in which price goes very low, you might think this is awesome for consumers. In a lot of places, that doesn't equilibrate. A lot of industries doesn't equilibrate very fast, right? If the price of steel goes low, the second it comes back, you start to, your steel mills are often still running because it's, I'm going to run them. But in oil and gas, if you stop investing because you don't have any money, production will fall, and then it's hard to bring it back. Okay. All right. Last thing is the one bucket reality. I spent the last 30 years trying to explain this to my family and friends. People talk a lot about trade flows. They're like, oh, we're getting this oil from Saudi Arabia, and that's great, or that's terrible, whatever it is, right? And this is how much we get from Canada. We're dependent on them. Not really. Like the map at the right, the world is fed by a vast trading network of a commodity. What does it mean it's a commodity? Is, you know what? It is identical almost. It's not identical, but for all intents and purposes, it is. So the point is, when you think about flows of oil, do not really think about bilateral flows like, oh, you know, Indonesia is sending barrels here, or Venezuela feeds the US, because it is very fungible. That's what we've seen in the last year. I like to say every day, all the oil produced goes into one bucket, and every day all the buyers buy out of that bucket. Okay. So you can think of it like a single market with very rapid transmission and the ability to, it's good because if we have a shortfall because we get a winter storm, that looks great because we can meet that shortfall by importing from somewhere else. But on the same token, we are beholden. And if somebody else falls down or something blows up, it immediately, I mean, within a day, it will translate into what we have here or experiencing here in terms of the pricing. So that marginal pricing, right? The price of oil and gas comes from that marginal barrel, and it's constantly going down unless you're replacing it. So you get a lot of issues there and a lot of transmission. Creates more volatility, right? It also, as much as it solves your problems. Next is low elasticity. This is not a surprise. Like I say, if when the price of oil went down, nobody drives to work twice. Okay, so it's hard for demand to like come up as pricing goes, right? And at the same time, it's very, very hard for supply to get going. It's like the pandemic, you know, when all of a sudden we needed a bunch of doctors. You know, you don't say, I got good news, I'm going to med school, okay? It doesn't help you much, okay? Same thing with most supply around the world. If the prices go up, it's very difficult to bring on new supply very quickly, okay? It's mostly pretty slow, multi-year cycle. So you have inelastic, unresponsive supply, and you have unresponsive demand. Now, as we saw last year, I'll talk about in a second, demand does respond somewhat on the upside, right? And then substitution. I think, you know, Jerry made a great point about, or maybe it was Jamie, about the lack of coal capacity in the US. So the closure of the, you know, about a third of the coal capacity in the power sector over the last 10 years means that when the gas price goes up, you don't really have the option anymore to, I'll just run more coal, and that will reduce the amount of natural gas I need. So you are structurally changing. When you structurally change the nature of the fuel supply and the redundancy of the system and the overlap between the fuels, which is happening, you are automatically and structurally creating volatility. And nowhere have we seen this more than in the US gas market. We had very minimal deficits last year, but they were associated with massive, during the summer as we tried to refill storage, they were associated with massive, massively high prices compared to what we would have experienced at the same deficit level even a couple of years ago, right? So right now is, you know what, if it's hot in the summer, I have one choice and just about one choice only, right? Which is natural gas. And so I'm going to take whatever it does to pay. That lack of substitution has really increased the volatility on a structural basis. All right, if you go to the next slide. And I promise I'll go faster, Jamie. A couple of, I just want to make one interesting point here, and I will say this. You look at life as terms of both your security of supply of energy and the price, right? And that's fine. Producers and consumers both are seeking security, right? And when you think about that, everybody likes to think the oil and gas companies are setting the price and you know, oh, they're gouging me or whatever. They don't. It's a commodity. There is a single price, one bucket theory. Okay. But both of them seek security. The producer wants somebody to sell to, and the consumer wants somebody to buy from. But honestly, it's a lot more problematic for consumers if stuff stops. If the flow stops, it's very difficult. Okay. And, you know, frankly, physical shortfalls can be catastrophic. And so when you think about this, not only efficiency, not only do you think about cost, but you have to think about security and your ability to get this. In the US, there's not as much of a problem, okay? And this is what's important. If the one thing I would say is that when you think about a price spike like we had last year, in most markets in the US, you do not need to think about availability risk, because the modern market converts availability risk to affordability risk, okay? Modern market converts availability risk to affordability risk. In other words, if prices go up, okay, it's not that you can't get something, or if let's say there's a bombing in a key producer state next year, or like Russia, it's going to, we saw, wow, all of a sudden now supplies disappear from a very large producer. You think that somebody's going to do without supply. No, what happens is you get an affordability risk because it rapidly converts into price, and you price people out of the system, right? Markets are rationing energy every single day. We don't like to think about it, but that's true. If you look at the graph on the right, this is my attempt to get at that. So take a look at first the green dotted line. And the notion here is that, you know what? If I look at the world's population, which is running across the x-axis, okay, and you can see the countries there. Obviously, you got China and India, the two biggies, right? What I did then was I said, hey, when oil is $60, look at the left axis. This is where all the countries rank in terms of the percentage of GDP that is necessary for them to afford to buy oil, all the oil that runs their system at $60. So what you see here is, look at the left-hand axis again. So that first country on the left, okay, they only need to spend 1% of their income on oil if oil is at $60. Okay, that's not bad. And you go up, and you know, China spends about 2% of its income, and you know, other people spend about 3, 4, 5. Notice all the way to the right, there is a group of countries for whom it is very difficult or impossible to buy it unless they spend 8 or 10%. Now, there's generally a threshold at around 4% that you can think of, okay? And so you can see the green lines at 4% left axis. Basically, in a $60 market, the only people being rationed from a price percentage who need to spend more than 4% are a group of poor countries on the right-hand side. Now, look what happens if it goes to 120. At 120, now use the right-hand axis. And now you can see that basically almost 80% of the world has to spend 4% or more of GDP just to run to get the oil that they typically will use. That is huge. Okay. So the movement, as you move from 60 to 120, the market makes whenever you get a shortfall, right, either from too much demand or not enough supply, is important. That sends a signal cascading through all of these economies and all of these companies and all these projects. And frankly, from an efficiency point of view, it starts to make things important. And you know, and all these companies, all of a sudden, it wasn't a problem when energy was 1% or 2%, but when it goes to 7 or 8% of their cost, two things happen. One, it starts to create problems for the companies, but secondly, it also creates opportunity for efficiency. In a lot of ways, you know, efficiency is projects work best and people pay the most attention to it at these times. And you can just get an idea of that for this. And the market will continue through transmission to turn crises of availability into crises of affordability. All right, next slide. I guess the thing I want to mention here is, as you think about, I notice a lot of these efficiency groups are government funded. And it's interesting because when you get to that, you start thinking about policies. And while prices cut through policies, one thing I would just notice is that energy policy, in my mind, I'm not trying to be cynical or skeptical, but it is almost impossible for the US or any country really to have a highly coherent energy policy. Okay. And in a lot of ways, why? Well, because energy affects every single thing that we do, right? Honestly, modern life, it is probably the #1 ingredient of modern prosperity and life quality, okay? And so the problem is that it is so multidimensional that if you ask 3 people, what's your sort of prioritization of the characteristics of energy systems that we need, okay? Everybody's got a different hierarchy, okay? And so some people want nice to have, you know, as zero carbon. Other people, no, that's my #1 deal. Okay. What about reliability? What about being domestic? What about, you know, being cheap and scalable and all of those things, right? Affordable. Those are really important.
TIEEN.
All right. And so the point is, when you have a crisis, it reveals your preferences and people start to argue. So my general view is that if you're waiting on a coherent policy for all times, you're probably not going to get one. You may be disappointed. But I think that the economics of projects, as we get to increased volatility, and I'd bake that volatility into your economics, by the way, become more and more important in terms of finding efficiency opportunities, taking advantage of them, and profiting from them. All right, if you go to the last slide, the last sort of concept I wanted to introduce. Oh, next one. Thank you. All right, is this notion of I'm imagining that most people on this call are engineers, for whom I have a lot of respect. I've worked with a lot of engineers over my life. I'm not an engineer. I guess I couldn't make it. I'm more on the economics and analysis side. What I find interesting, though, is that a couple of concepts that I think are interesting. Over the last 30 years, we have largely engineered our way into a global economic system. And this covers manufacturing industries, it covers trading industries, it covers financial industries, it covers a lot of things. And the mantra has been efficiency and ruthless cutting of costs and gaining a lot of efficiency, okay? And that's a great thing, except that by definition, in a lot of ways, any system which is highly engineered is going to be vulnerable to disruption, okay? It's going to have a tough time dealing with volatility and unexpected events because efficiency is the enemy of duplication. It's the enemy of redundancy. And, you know, we've seen this in the popular press, and they're saying, oh, we're moving from a just-in-time inventory, right, into a just-in-case inventory, right? And I think that captures it pretty well. The point is, as you think about systems and as you think about engineering for energy efficiency, I think you need to think about optionality. And, you know, if we think about it in a simple sort of efficient frontier kind of basis, right? Like in the graph over there, and I put this energy security or risk is on one axis and the value or cost is on the other, right? So the deal is, where would everybody like to live? everybody would like to live, of course, in the top left of the deal, where I got high security, I got low risk and high value and low cost. Woohoo! That's like nirvana. Unfortunately, the real world doesn't work that way, right? The real world involves trade-offs. And I would argue that humans inherently are pretty terrible at risk analysis, okay? We just don't get it. Now, and we tend to waver. If you have a time of high volatility, like we just experienced, or high insecurity or high risk, you tend to fight the last war, right? And you go for total security. Yeah. On the other hand, you know, if you had a time of sleepiness where everything's going, frankly, pretty well, you tend to forget the risk and you go toward, higher value and lower cost. The point is, I think it's the job of companies to understand where they are on that efficient frontier. It's the job of executives to understand how much risk they're willing to take. Okay. And of course, you notice as you move up the line toward the right, you don't want to be one of the suboptimal outcomes, right? You don't want to be there. But if you want to live on the efficient frontier, let's say the solid line, those are your choices. And all those choices are good. They're all optimal, okay? But they involve different levels of risk acceptance and different levels of value for them, right? And so I think the job of the engineers is to be smart enough, okay, to move the curve outward. And that's what I see. And the only thing I would say about this is you're the innovators. You push the efficient frontier outward, okay, to deliver more for the same cost or less, more value for the same cost or lower cost for the same value and security, right? And that's, in my mind, this whole notion of what optionality are these projects creating? Yeah. Do they have the ability to live in a volatile world? Are they one way? Are they moving the curve out? Or are they moving you along the curve such that you can make different choices along with changing circumstances? So those are the concepts I kind of wanted to throw out there today. I hope that they're useful and we can move on to discussion.
Thanks for going through this, and there's been some frantic chat. So some barring speaker allowances of slides to be shared, things will be slides will be available, and there'll be a recording online as well. We are pretty much at time. I can't speak for Raoul or Jeremy, but I'm happy to go over a few minutes and answer some of the questions that have come through.
So just for clarification, Jamie, we actually have another half hour available.
Oh, we do. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought this was finishing at 3 because the initial thing.
Yeah.
Cool. No, this works for me. So apologies for the scheduling confusion. So first of all, thank you to Raoul and Jeremy for your fascinating presentations. And if you're all interested, there's the Volts podcast, which goes into the Rondo technology in a bit more detail. The new thing on this recently is utterly interesting. So as we're going to questions, there's a couple things that cropped up that I wanted to ask some people. So Jeremy, there was a question that came through about, why would Texas care about European and Californian carbon prices? And this is something that I've certainly heard from many clients is, in places outside of California or a few other jurisdictions, why should they pay attention to what goes on in other markets? And I was wondering, kind of given your experience and given your thoughts, if you could share any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit in the presentation, but just to reiterate that, the European Union has adopted what they call a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and they're rolling out such that imports from outside of the European Union will be subject to the EU's carbon price. And that's been floating around 70, 80, 90 euros per ton of CO2, which is equivalent to about $100 a ton CO2 here in the States. And just for reference, California has a carbon price, and it today trades at $30 a ton of CO2. So it's, sorry, lawnmower. So that it's, Texas is going to be more and more exposed as more markets adopt these sort of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And then, I mentioned it also that there's these other carbon prices where if you're a producer feeding into those markets, you can realize that carbon value, and they're more of like a revenue stream. The low carbon fuel standard is one of them. California is also adopting a standard for cement that's coming on. And then, there's been proposals out there around low carbon intensity materials, being able to realize a value for delivering something that has a lower carbon intensity than others. So like green premiums.
And just to add to that, something that I've been seeing as well is, the whole rise of RSG, or responsibly sourced gas. So the concept of this is basically you track the methane or CO2 emissions across the value chain. And as a result of that, you can kind of come up with a carbon intensity of gas. And especially for LNG players or for a variety of other people, this is getting baked into people's LCAs, or carbon emissions accounting. And so while, directly the carbon markets in California or Europe don't necessarily apply, there's definitely an indirect thing as people start to kind of focus things through. And then additional to that, there's definitely some, California carbon, carbon markets, or LCFS, which is their low carbon fuel standard, did get adopted by other states. And there's other mechanisms which are kind of similar to that globally as well. And so there's definitely some follow through there. So yeah.
I think also, in some places that, the California low carbon fuel standards, right? The money that is paid out doesn't necessarily have to be within that jurisdiction, right? The notion is it's a global problem, right? And frankly, we see this too a lot of times when we look at something. I'm sure you see this on the efficiency side too. Imagine somebody is removing carbon, the Norwegians are removing carbon in a system that's already low carbon, right? And that $10 million, if that could be spent somewhere else, it actually makes an enormous amount of sense, right? It's terribly inefficient to spend it and do these things by jurisdiction for a global problem. And I think some places realize that, and so there's sometimes money available for those.
Yeah, absolutely. Raoul, there's a question here that came through to me as well around, how does energy systems deal with sort of black swan events that we've seen in recent years? I'm assuming it's like Winter Storm Uri, for example. How are we planning for those as well?
Yeah, badly, I would say, is the best answer. But by nature, we typically don't do that, right? Like, sure, I have insurance, but do I have meteor insurance? I do not have meteor insurance, okay? I do not have a meteor shield on my house. Will I be sorry if my house gets struck by a meteor shield? Absolutely, I will. But my cost benefit analysis suggests that it's not worth doing, right? But then these events come along, whether it's the pandemic or the invasion of Ukraine, right? And they throw a monkey wrench into this. And so it sort of points out this notion that if you live in this world, a couple of things is, one, you need to spend some money, and the industry is trying to figure out how to do this, the energy system. I need to spend money on long tail events, on response to long tail events, such that when Winter Storm Uri comes through, right? I was in my house in Houston, right? And it wasn't all that fun, I got to tell you, okay? And there's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking after these things happen, okay? The key there is, though, how do you spend money but not spend too much money, right? And so I see people investigating optionality and redundancy. And probably, I think one of the things that needs to happen is that important elements of the system need to change in terms of the pricing structures or other structures that pay for some of these redundancies. The other thing is, frankly, you generally need to ensure that that these long tail events, or let me put it this way, that the remediation mechanisms of long tail events pay off, right? Otherwise, why would I do it? Yeah. And this has been the problem with things like a price cap, right? Is if you do that price cap, nobody's going to want to take a chance on spending money for years and years on the notion that something marginal is going to come along and I'm going to get paid out for it, right? And so one of the things is sort of ironically, the more you try to keep a system stable, the less stable it becomes over the long run. The more you actually increase its vulnerability. So I think that's an interesting systems element.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. And that's, you know, I think consistent where it's always hard to plan around things that are hard to by nature predict. And there's also a cost benefit analysis to doing a lot of these things. And, you know, nobody has a crystal ball at the end of the day. So it's and especially in the world we're heading into where energy systems are fundamentally changing, and risks are fundamentally changing. We're definitely heading into an interesting situation.
I agree. I think, you know, and it gets to the, you know, like I say, if you're running an efficiency project, what can you do to try to build in optionality? Yeah. Can you do it intelligently and in a design way such that when you get there, or, you know, Jeremy's presentation, what can you do to build in something that can take advantage of minus $33? Yeah. Yeah. Like that's a whole optionality system we've got going there. So interesting.
And kind of segue into this is there's a question to me around, you know, the Ukraine-Russia war and the impact on the US energy markets, which is another black swan event in terms of how that impacts things on the US market. Is, you know, the short answer is that in the short term, it didn't really have much impact directly on the US. It had a massive impact on Europe and other parts of the world, but US gas markets were already flowing at max capacity. Right. It takes a long time to build LNG liquefaction capacity, so you couldn't bring it on quickly. Absolutely. So you may have increased utilization a little bit, but not a heck of a lot. Meanwhile, Freeport LNG did go down, and that also freed up about 2 BCFD. But the bigger question, and this is where the optionality thing comes in to continue on the trend around optionality, is, you know, LNG is inherently optional, has optionality, especially in inherent flexibility. And in a market like the US, where you have a lot more, given the way the LNG market's structured, et cetera, it's just a lot more flexible. You know, there's an argument to be had that it could have encouraged additional LNG investment, or accelerated a few things. However, we're not really seeing that because people are cautious to take the 20-year contracts. But you could see basically an acceleration of some of the FIDs. But it's proving surprisingly tricky to find people willing to commit to a 20-year contract, when, you know, a lot of the views of the Ukraine war is a temporary thing as the energy transition goes full pelt. So it's been a kind of a long-winded answer saying, you know, short term didn't have much impact. Long term, you could see additional demand for US LNG or more volatile demand for US LNG, which would impact gas markets, but, you know, not as much as you probably would expect. So relatively muted, all said and done. Cool.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that is all the transmission stuff that I talked about for oil markets is not necessarily true for gas markets, because so much gas is done by pipeline. A pipeline is inherently flexible. It starts in one place and goes to another place, and that's all you can do. Oil on the water is what makes everything, you know, completely pliable and flexible and fungible. But the more you put LNG, right, which is, you know, gas on the water, and allow multiple destinations to go anywhere, the more interesting it becomes. And what that means for US consumers in Texas is, yeah, you are now exposed to the volatility that can roil the global market, yeah, which may take your gas away from you, okay? And so you would have, you know, you thought $6 was bad, you know, just imagine what had happened if there was full LNG fungibility and all that gas was flowing to Europe, where they're paying, you know, $30 or $40 per MMBTU, right? So the build out of the LNG system is an intentional thing to try, because the US producers want some of that LNG market, but it opens up a new level of transmission capability that everybody here is going to have to deal with.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there's a specific question for you, Jerry, that kind of came through around storage and dispatch technology, and that kind of came through in the chat. I was wondering if you would able to address that in terms of how the Rondo is able to be dispatchable into the power system.
Yeah, sorry, I was just finding the question. So our thermal storage uses refractory bricks as the energy storage media. So it's the same brick that's been used in the steel blast furnaces for 200 years. We heat it up to about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. And so those bricks are the actual storage media. We heat the bricks with electric resistance heaters. It's the same heaters used in the metal heat treating industry. So it's tried and true technology packaged in a new, novel, innovative way, but no interesting material science happening. What we see from the grid participation is that with those electric resistance heaters, we could turn them off and on rapidly enough because we have enough of them that battery can still provide grid services. And so you can participate in the markets just like the lithium ion batteries do. So you can provide frequency regulation, spinning reserve, those sorts of things. So and when you think about charging at 100 megawatts for a 70,000 pounds of steam an hour boiler, 70,000 pounds of steam it's a medium-sized industrial facility. It's not huge, it's not small, but 100 megawatts of electricity is giant from most people's point of view. A lot of folks really miss the scale of how big industrial process heat is. But you're now an asset on the grid. And so you're able to take advantage of some of those wholesale prices, and you can get, hedging contracts and things like that you otherwise, maybe would have not been had access to with them if you were only trying to hedge your 2 megawatt facility load or something like that.
That's fascinating. Just to expand on something, you mentioned that you can play in spinning reserve markets and some of the ancillary markets. Would you kind of take me through that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's in Texas, it's the controllable load resources, the market participation pathway. And so you're submitting a price into the day ahead in the real-time market. You're getting dispatched. If you're charging at 40 megawatts, you can increase your charging by 20 megawatts, or you can decrease your charging by 20 megawatts within seconds. And so you can provide that frequency regulation and then the spinning reserve resource as well.
Fascinating. I didn't realize you could help solve that problem, because that is a major problem as we're reading about today. Cool. There's a question that also came through in the chat in terms of, I had the fundamental gas cost curve, and it had $62 a barrel oil assumption. And there's the question was, how realistic is that given what we've seen recently with oil prices? The short answer is that it doesn't really impact gas prices as much in the US as you would expect, because higher oil prices, the projects that are economic at 80 were still economic at 62. So the amount of associated gas you get into the market doesn't change that much on the higher oil price. And so the overall, fundamentals of the gas market don't change too much. You don't start suddenly dispatching or producing quote unquote free or negative price gas because you're not $80. You still require a lot of dry gas drilling. And so we still stay at the kind of, base case scenario around, $275, $280 long-term fundamentals. So it doesn't impact things too much. Another question came through, and this is around, the permanency of efficiency gains. And Raoul, I think this is for you, is, how do upstream producers think about this on the supply side of the equation when, continuous and permanent efficiency gains? And how do your producers think about that on the demand side?
Yeah, so, the oil producers they often have projects which are multi-year. They go a long time, and so they're very concerned about this. And one of the interesting things for them is they're completely aware that efficiency has been a slow, steady, quiet force in the market, but it is always present, it seems like, right? Things just get better, and one of those ways in which they get better is around efficiency. And they're offsetting things. For example, cars are much more efficient now, but we also decided to upsize all our cars. Okay. And so you lost some of that. But over time, that is what they view as responsible for the fact that your GDP will grow by, 2%, and your energy demand or oil demand will only grow by 1%, right? So you're in a situation where they're looking at that, and they're thinking about peak demand. They're thinking about when, the world may roll over, whether it's due to carbon concerns or sort of economic maturity of key markets. It looks like a place. And so they'll look at that, and interestingly, it is making them, all these factors, including efficiency gain and slow growing markets, do two things. Number one is it makes something like shale into a disruptive force. Shale was growing by 10 or 15% a year, right? Now, it wasn't by any means an enormous market compared to the enormous size of the global oil market. But what it did mean is, hey, it was growing fast enough that it kept killing the price. Okay, so one is efficiency gains stop the make rapid growth and market share grabs disrupted the prices because they slow down the overall growth of that. And the second one is they make people reluctant. They're like, okay, so my cars are all going to get more efficient, and therefore I'm going to maybe not have much of a market. And we're seeing a reluctance to invest, driven by a lot of things, but certainly the sort of prospects for demand are one of them. And so ironically, the lack of investment and the drive to start taking profits in because it's not a growth market is leading to higher prices in the long run, right?
I wanted to go back to one of the questions about the optionality or a discussion about that. One of the things in the efficiency space that we often see is that, you know, making the capital investment in that efficiency, be it traditional energy efficiency measures at your facility or something like a heat battery that's, you know, an optionality on your fuel source. You know, as you think about your downside risk or your recession risk, you can become, you know, the low cost producer. And so as your commodity prices decline and your competitors are, you know, their margins are squeezing, you're still able to maintain your higher margins. And so there's, you know, in that case, you may not get the return on capital investment that you originally targeted, but you're able to continue to operate through those downtime periods. And so there's, you know, that optionality and that downside protection and, you know, protection from essentially going bust is one of those, it's a value stream that's not, doesn't show up in the cash flow, but from a risk adjustment that, you know, Raoul was talking about how bad we all are at that. It is a big upside that oftentimes the CFO will understand, but it's hard for us to put in the cash flow analysis.
It's a good point, Jeremy. In general, you know, people run their cash flow. Great, I did this. I put a whole bunch of work in. I got the costs right. I got this. But there's very little around what if, right? Which everybody knows, right? I mean, the only thing we know about a cash flow projection is it's not going to happen. Okay, yeah. You may get close, you may get not close, but we know it's not going to be the way it is, right? And so trying to find ways to show risk, show resiliency, right? Show optionality is important. It's a little bit tough sell because I think, frankly, a lot of executives or, you know, investment committees don't know what to do with those numbers. Yeah. I mean, I remember we had an enormous task at Anadarko of understanding exactly the risk. We're in a high risk business. We're in exploration, right? And so we'd show this efficient frontier and we'd say to management, okay, in your basic deal, you can have two choices. You can have this thing, which is higher risk and get you, you know, 3 billion more, or this one, which is low risk and get you 3 billion less. Which one do you like? And it's really hard for people to say, what is my risk tolerance? What is my risk? Yeah. And so we had to resort to running Monte Carlo simulations and say, this one means 3 times out of 10, you're gonna have to stand up in front of the board and the world and say you failed. And this one is 7 times out of 10. Okay. Which one of those do you like? Right. And, but anyway, it's hard, like you pointed out to get across what is the value of optionality? How does it play into these things? And how can I show it in a way that gets into the economics for project approval?
Sometimes I discuss it as future proofing as well, right? Like in that, you know, we're specifically a sustainability solution. And in Texas, there's not a strong sustainability push today. But as you look at the course of the rest of the globe of where it's heading, you know, things that are economically attractive, but give you that future proof of sustainability for the future, there's additional optionality value there as well.
Right. It's just it's hard to quantify too, right?
I mean, optionality is fiendishly hard to qualify, but you know, there's even a thing beyond the financial aspect, which is kind of what we've been focusing on. You know, most non-energy companies don't want to have to think about energy costs in a way that impacts their bottom line. They'd much rather focus on their core business, which is going to be making other things. And so anything they can do to minimize their costs and minimize the volatility of those costs enables them and their management time to think about doing things that are actually their core business. And so even, you know, there's a certain value to to not having to worry about these things. And that's where I think, flexibility type things like a Rondo battery, for example, can help, even beyond the whole financial implications of this. There's a business sense to this and a strategic angle to this as well.
Yeah.
So I've been taking canned questions here. Just want to open it up to anybody else on the Zoom to see if there's any questions, anything anybody wants to ask live, or I'm also happy to continue to field questions that kind of came through via the chat during the presentation.
Somebody asked me for the round trip efficiency. So an electric boiler, if you're familiar with those, is about 100% efficient, electricity in to steam out. And we're a little bit less efficient than that. So from electricity in to steam out, we're about 98% efficient. We often get asked, and I'll just head that off, if you think about, a lot of industry is looking at hydrogen as like the solution for high temperature industrial process heat. And for hydrogen, for electrolytic hydrogen, from electricity in to splitting the water to hydrogen to storage to then combustion, you're kind of like 50% round trip efficiency. Another way to say that is if you're building a 70 megawatt solar field to power your facility, which is what you would need for about 70,000 pounds of steam an hour. If you were to do it with hydrogen, you would need to build a 140 megawatt solar facility just to get the same amount of annual energy.
And you'd still need the investment of the storage and the generator and et cetera, to make that work.
Yep.
So. Cool. So unless there's anybody who has anything to interrupt, I will, or enter any other additional questions. I'm happy to kind of continue going with some of the email questions. There's a question here around, gas and power prices and how they're related. So, I primarily focused on gas, natural gas. In most markets, power is essentially set by the cost of the most expensive electricity source. And I'm simplifying here, and this is where power markets get fiendishly complicated, but essentially the highest cost energy power source sets the price. And as the markets have built out, that is almost always set by gas generation. And gas generation, one of their biggest costs is going to be the underlying cost of the gas molecule. And as a result, in many markets in the US, particularly, and especially in Texas, there is a very strong correlation between gas and power prices. So, you're not incorrect in thinking that if gas prices are high, power prices are going to be high, and vice versa. And this is where, there's a lot of simplifying things that go into this, but essentially, if you look at if you understand gas markets, you'll kind of understand the way that the power prices are heading as well.
We're seeing that that's changing quite a bit and pretty rapidly, and that, as you look at the penetration of wind and solar, and especially when they have 4-hour batteries attached to them, more and more hours of the day, they're the marginal generator and they're the ones setting the price. And so the price is no longer being set necessarily by the cost of natural gas. It's being set by the opportunity cost of what would they receive later.
Absolutely. And that's kind of where like West Texas is different than than East Texas. It's different than Houston, where you got the renewable build out and there's transmission, interconnectivity, a variety of other things. And this is where there's definitely regional elements to gas and power prices. But yeah.
One thing to add to that is we're talking about wholesale power prices, right?
Yes.
Real-time power prices, right? And for a lot of small companies, or big companies, right, they go through a whole other infrastructure of people passing on those instantaneous prices. So even though the prices of gas may be low right now today, there may be people who are still paying pretty high prices due to last year. We've seen that a lot in Europe, right? In other words, companies are not able to take advantage of the low wholesale gas price because it's not come through yet. But they didn't suffer as much on the way up either.
As many of us are in Texas and many of us are in the Houston area, the whole power to choose, being able to choose your power tariff. I am very much looking forward to renewing my power tariff when I was forced to renew it when gas prices were $6. So there you go.
Yeah.
This is definitely something where being an energy geek is helpful. Cool.
Oh, I was going to add one thought on that is that, as you look to the future of, and, say we're successful, but also as renewable markets penetrate to 60, 70, 80% of the hours of the year, there's actually going to be this class of, like a heat battery that's participating in the wholesale market or electric boilers and those sorts of things, where demand is actually setting the marginal price because dispatchable demand is choosing when to buy and what their avoided cost is. And so the electricity markets actually become a two-sided market, when in the past they've always been one-sided and demand is just, inflexible. So those are one of the things that we're kind of starting to see, and it's already starting. The Bitcoin miners are the example right now.
Just
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we got about 2 minutes, and then I've got just a closing slide. But there was a question here in the chat, and then perhaps if all of you could think about a 20-second summary of the main point. But Jeremy, I see there's a question in the chat for you about thinking about PTC drive to -33 renewable prices, production credit, I guess that is. What would TDSP charges look like in that scenario?
Transmission, distribution, and something.
Yeah,
Is that the acronym?
That's one I'm not familiar with. TDSP, perhaps Wyatt, you can put that in the chat.
I'm going to guess it's transmission distribution charges. It really depends on where you are in the world. In Texas, your transmission charges are on like a 5 coincident peak for ERCOT. And so oftentimes the coincident peak is not when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining. So, your transmission charge will be set later. Distribution, it's again, depending on the distribution utility. But if you get big enough, 100 megawatts, you're likely not connecting a distribution, you're connecting a transmission. So you're going to be missing some of those or skipping some of them. And there's a lot of work to be done on tariff reform and alignment for these sorts of things of like, the utilities should be really excited about you buying when load is low and when the wind's blowing. But there's pathways to kind of avoid those.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a recurring theme here around energy markets are really not set up for the future of how things are going. Like power markets, there's a bit of a thing where you think about how we do this differently. But to respond to Alan's comment, I think if I was to summarize my key point is, we're coming out of a time of historic volatility, which we've not seen in a while around the energy markets. We're coming into a time of, great uncertainty, especially on the demand side, where things are going to be shifting, and there's a geopolitical angle to this, all of this as well. And as in terms of energy efficiency and things that you can do, if you don't spend much on energy, you don't have to worry about the volatility around this. And this is where I think energy efficiency is kind of a no regrets move from both a strategic, oftentimes financial, and then increasingly from a customer perspective where they want to see lower carbon emissions. So I think, en masse energy efficiency is one of the easier things to do.
Good.
I would just say that volatility is, it's both up and down.
Yeah.
And so on the micro level where you're able to invest to take advantage of that, like you can realize cost savings from being flexible or having storage and those sorts of things.
Great. Raoul.
Yeah, I guess for me, I would say there are structural reasons that drive volatility in energy prices. They're very difficult to get rid of. Don't expect them to go away. And in some ways, the key here is when you think about security of supply, don't think so much about physical shortfalls. Think a lot about the price and what happens to that as those get converted into crises of affordability. Don't expect policy to probably come to the rescue and calm everything down, because I don't think that works in the long run. And focus on optionality and what you can do for the what if, and bring that into your projects and your economics.
Great, thank you very much. And I know we've hit our deadline, but there are just a few more closing comments. And if we can have the slide deck back up, please, while we get into this. One thing I did just want to mention first was we did have an additional panelist originally on the list. Those of you who looked at the website, Derek Reese from API, regrettably had to deal with a family emergency, and he sends his apologies. He wishes he could have been with us, but unfortunately, that's the way it turned out. Next slide, please. No. So you were right you're in the right area. We're at the bottom of the deck. And if we can go full screen, that'd be great. So the next upcoming event, and this is actually for the sister organization of TIEEN, which is TEEP, the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Program. The next event is the Spring Water Forum, which is on May 4th. Details on the screen. This is about energy efficiency and decarbonization in the industrial use of water. And those of you who are in the Houston area, this will be in person at San Jacinto College Center for Petrochemical Energy and Technology. For those of you who are not able to get to it in person, it is a hybrid event. And if you follow the link on the page, you'll find both registration links, both in person and online. Next slide, please. Before I talk about these, I did omit a moment ago to thank the panel that was able to appear today. So Jamie, thanks very much for your very effective moderating activities and also your own thoughts that you shared. And Jeremy, great to see an energy storage option out there that looks like it's got some great economics. And Raoul, some very profound insights from you as well. Much appreciated there. Thanks so much. I learned a lot. Wish I had time to soak it all in. But anyway, I know a number of you are very interested in getting PDH certificates. Again, if you want to scribble down the address, the URL from the screen, you're welcome to do that. Or alternatively, I did just put it in the chat, so you can use that as well. And finally, as I'd mentioned right at the beginning, we try to collect feedback on each of our events. And so we do have a survey. Again, I've put the survey link in the chat, and we'll leave them there for a few moments so you can follow those links and get your PDH certificates. And also, please fill in the surveys. We want to know what you thought. We want to know how we can improve things as well. So with that, I think I will leave the webinar running for a few moments just to let people copy those if they wish, the things that have just gone in the chat. But again, thanks again to the panel. Thanks to everyone who joined, and we look forward to seeing you at the Water Forum if you're able to make it, and to future TEEP and TIEEN events as they come up. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.